The story of a sound, the man who created it, the girl who sang it, the monster who stole it, and the phantom who haunts the paradise, the ultimate rock palace. 20th Century Fox presents Phantom of the Paradise, a gothic horror story.
Hello and welcome back to The GOAT, a Brian DePalma fan podcast. And once again, I am joined by my friend David. David, welcome.
Greetings. How are you?
Good, thanks. Hey, so before we went on, just some transparency. We don't record these episodes, the day before they go live or anything. We're recording this a couple of days previously. And a couple hours ago, we learned about the passing of David Lynch. And I think we both think that when talking about on a movie podcast, it would be hard not to mention it before we get started.
Yeah, and in fact, it was something interesting that I thought of. I don't think he has any real connection to Brian DePalma at all, but a long time ago when I interviewed Brian DePalma for creative screenwriting, he mentioned about how he had a style that was able to go in and out of the mainstream. And funny enough, so did David Lynch as well, to some extent. Now, I don't think he ever could have done something like Mission Impossible, but if he did, that would have been interesting. But he had an interesting thing too, where he could do something like The Elephant Man,
Yes.
and then, do his own idiosyncratic work, for lack of a better term. And, he could still be successful on his own terms, making his own films as well. That was one thing I thought of today when he passed away, which is terrible. I know that he'd been ill for a while, but
emphysema from what I remember.
Yeah, but I also know he was just determined to do whatever it took to make his next film, even if he had to direct it
remotely.
Yeah, he was talking about that. So
yeah. It's funny. I always talk about on this show how De Palma was able to operate in different genres, and then if you think about it, you have even if we're just looking at his mainstream films, you have like Dune, which was like this big sci-fi epic, which was capitalized, like Dino De Laurentiis, trying to capitalize on Star Wars years later. But then also he could make a grounded film like The Straight Story, which I remember when The Straight Story came out, I was like, wow, a G-rated David Lynch movie. This I have to go see. And it was a great, touching, tender work.
Yeah. And also, from what everyone had said, supposedly he was like the nicest guy in the world to work with. It was such an interesting dichotomy, considering how dark and and visceral a lot of his work is. But everyone said supposedly he was like one of the nicest, most chill people you could have. Even Nicolas Cage said when he did Wild at Heart, he said that was the most fun I ever had making a movie.
Yeah. Well, I also think the sort of connection we can make artistically between De Palma and Lynch would definitely be they both were acutely aware of the fact that they were making movies, in the sense that, logic took a back seat to the artistic expression.
Right. Yeah. And it's an interesting thing too, because for me also, to me, David Lynch really was a real artist. I don't think he was like a guy who was necessarily being weird for the sake of being weird. If you really look at his work, and also, paintings and stuff that I remember seeing in the documentary about him and stuff. There was a real artist at work. It wasn't somebody who was intentionally trying to be provocative or, again, being weird for the sake of being weird.
No, it was who he was.
Yeah, he definitely followed his own drum, and there's no other filmmaker that can make movies like that. He's probably as uncopyable as you can get.
Yeah. So just sort of mourning the artistic loss, aside from the personal loss. I didn't know him; he was a fellow human being. But aside from that, definitely mourning the artistic loss, because he brought a lot to the table in terms of the art of filmmaking and helping it progress to what it is today. But what we're talking about today, David, is I'm so excited to revisit this movie because it's one of my favorites in the De Palma catalog, and that's 1974's The Phantom of the Paradise. Now, we're also both big, heavy music guys. Was that kind of the initial appeal of this movie when you first discovered it and responded to it?
I don't think so on that one, and I can't remember the exact moment in time when I saw it. I think my interest was first piqued in it with and peaked with a Q, not with a K, but peaked. I'm not sure if I used that correctly or not,
Hmm.
but was reading about it in Danny Peary's cult movies. I think it's in the second volume, or was it the first? I can't remember. But seeing the image of the Phantom with that weird helmet and all of that stuff kind of piqued my interest in that. And this is when I probably hadn't become like a full blown De Palma fan yet, but I was certainly aware of who he was. And becoming a heavy metal fan, and then seeing Phantom of the Paradise many years later. And again, I can't pinpoint exactly when I saw it, but I'm pretty sure I'd seen Spinal Tap before that. And it was kind of like a Spinal Tap before Spinal Tap, and also a little bit of Rocky Horror before Rocky Horror Picture
Hmm.
Show. Like we were talking about David Lynch's work, his stuff is always going to be ahead of its time. And this was a movie that was very ahead of its time. And I think that's why people are now catching up to the Phantom and rediscover. It seems like every 20 years I meet people or hear about people who are discovering it for the first time. And it's like, wow, where's this been all my life? This is a great, especially like people in the music business or people who are in bands and, or people that want to be songwriters and are just discovering the work of Paul Williams for the first time and things like that. So that was kind of what it was for me. It didn't hit the nail on the head for me as much as like Spinal Tap did, where it came out like right as heavy metal was exploding again, and it was like so on the money about what was going on right then. And actually Phantom of the Paradise was to some degree as well, because I think when they were making it in 73, I think that's when the like rock and roll had suddenly become like $1 billion industry or something like that. And bands were headlining stadiums and everything was getting so big and so over the top. And Brian De Palma really capitalized on that about how these bands are so big and everything had gotten so big and the stage shows were getting so over the top and the audiences, like he said, I think it was in Cinefantastique magazine. I can't remember the interview, but he said the audience loves to watch these bands like, blow themselves up on stage and they can't get enough and they want more and more and more. I mean, he really understood the whole thing about how people were, attracted to like the over the top bombastic part of it.
Oh no, absolutely, and it's definitely occurring in an era where we were getting into that very theatrical sort of shock rock, subgenre or whatever. And you could say Alice Cooper and Kiss sort of played in that sandbox, and then even like David Bowie with the Ziggy Stardust
Yeah.
persona. So rock was becoming very theatrical, and one of the things I love about Phantom of the Paradise is just it's just such a bold statement, and I think it's really De Palma's first big looking film.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting thing too, because I realized, with the scene with that band, the Undead, where they had the full face makeup. One thing I noticed watching it again is the background. I think that's from the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, if I'm not mistaken.
Seems like it, yeah.
The backdrop. So maybe that's why the face paint is in black and white. But if they were shooting it in 73, that was right before Kiss, came into the national stage because their first album came out in
Or
74. So
yeah,
it was
early
ahead of its
74,
time
yeah.
with that. And
Yeah.
it's also I mean, Alice Cooper was around at that time and was making a name for himself, and so was David Bowie. And De Palma, I think it was like he was looking at like the glam glitter period and just how over the top and how it had a lot of camp in it as well, as we saw with Queen. And it also, you know I think it also got the joke about itself, which the later heavy metal bands that Spinal Tap were making fun of didn't. you
Oh no,
know
yeah, absolutely. I think another great decision with Phantom of the Paradise was Paul Williams. I think I talked about on our previous Phantom episode. I think I said that I don't really think that De Palma could have made this movie without Paul Williams, and if he did, it would have been much different. Because in addition to the role of Swan that Paul Williams sort of presents, and he's such a unique looking guy, but then you also get the songwriting, and it's cohesive songwriting. But the other thing is, and a lot of times in music movies, when you're writing music for the movie, is you're not always getting the best songwriter to write these songs that are supposed to be great.
Yeah, he may have been also like a left of center or out of the box kind of choice because you weren't getting like a typical hard rock or heavy metal songwriter. It wasn't like they hired David Bowie to do something like a Spiders from Mars kind of music. It was somebody who, you know, back in the 70s got a bad rap because of, he was doing a lot of stuff that was considered easy listening and stuff. And it's remarkable how he's had a whole resurgence as a songwriter, and people are realizing now what a truly great songwriter he is.
Well, yeah, and it's because if you think about it, like once you strip away the genre constraints and break a song down fundamentally to what it is, that's when you can really either dismiss or embrace a song. I mean, and certain songs are just undeniable in their construction, and I think Paul Williams' songwriting style is just so exact and so precise and so good. And I think like even a song like if you look at the hell of it from the Phantom soundtrack, I mean that's a really sort of, it's a heavy song, but at the same time I think he's doing things that nobody else making heavy music at the time would have thought to do.
Yeah, it's more melodic, and it's got, some interesting changes in it as well. It sounds like I'm not the greatest musicologist or anything, but like there's the part in the song that almost sounds like it's going from minor to major,
Yeah.
and it's a little more lighthearted from like the like the heavier verses and things like that. So yeah, no, I mean it's I mean good songwriting is good songwriting, and it's funny too because like he did the Jim Henson special with the Emmett Otter Jug Band, and they had like that band The Nightmare where he had like a heavy song in that. And I think he had once said something to the effect of, even Jim Henson wanted to be naughty and do something like that.
Yeah. So the sequence from the movie that we're really going to sort of focus on, you mentioned, is the scene with the undead, with this the basically the song where they're putting beef together, someone super like you. And the cool thing about this is, we had a bunch of performers that were doing double duty during this movie. The main singer for the Undead is Harold Oblong. That stage name, his real name was Peter Elbling. And then we've also got Jeffrey Commoner, who was a musician, and then Archie Hahn, who was a very well known character actor. If you look at if you see him out of the makeup. For me, David, before I let you sort of talk to the song, the aspect of this scene that I really, really love is, especially the first time I watched the movie, is like you almost lose sight of the fact that you're watching a sort of a performance within a performance, where meaning I got so sucked up in the movie that when they, even as phony as it looks, when they cut off the hand for a minute, I was like, wait, did they just cut off that lady's hand?
Right. Yeah.
And I just think overall, in addition to the musical performance, and it's great that Phantom gives us complete musical performances. It's a complete song that also helps propel the story along, and also gives us a little bit of sort of like I said, a story within a story. And the construction of Beef is very, very cinematic, and I just love the way De Palma put that whole sequence together. I don't know if there was anything in particular you wanted to drill down on in terms of like what you really love about that sequence.
Probably just how I think he understood how a lot of bands at that time were using theatrics and saw the power of it. And, a lot of heavy metal guys are big horror film fans too. So, that's kind of something that struck me with that. And just like how you call a band something, like typical, like the Undead or something like that, I thought was kind of funny. There hasn't been a band called that. Maybe, oh no, wait, I guess there was a punk band called that.
Yeah, I
Even
think
the guy
so.
from the Misfits, I think, who had
Yeah.
Bobby Steele and the Undead or something like that. But yeah, I mean that was, and also again when I noticed the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari thing, and then how Beef is created like a Frankenstein monster, and I go, wow, I mean it looked like Rocky Horror it's very much like the same thing in Rocky Horror Picture Show. It looked very similar, and then I realized it's also the same studio too. 20th Century Fox, and that was also how they were kind of, I wouldn't say like capitalizing, but Rocky Horror grew out of the whole glam glitter period, which I think had ended in 74 or something like that, but it still came out later. And then it's one of those things you can see both movies and knowing nothing about the whole glam or glitter history or whatever and still enjoy it regardless. But again, I mean, I think that that segment was also about how, like it's almost like I don't know if De Palma made the comparison to like the Roman gladiator days where people like to go see bloodshed in a stadium, but there might have been some. Again, he talked about how rock fans love to see bands destroy themselves on stage and blow themselves up, and and they wanted just bigger and more and more and more, and it was becoming this whole era where it was getting bigger and more and getting, everything had to be bigger. The stadiums, the venues, who was sleeping with more groupies, who was doing more drugs. And that continued well into the 80s as well. But I think he kind of realized that maybe earlier before a lot of, or maybe as an outsider, because I don't know if he's really a rock and roll kind of guy. Although he's done some interesting stuff with music over the years. I remember.
Well, yeah, he directed the Dancing in the Dark video.
Yeah. Yeah. And also the whole thing, that was another big WTF for me when Body Double was playing on cable and seeing parts of that out of context. I'm going, what's Frankie Goes to Hollywood doing?
Yeah, you get like a music video dropped right into the middle of that movie as well.
Yeah, and that was really weird. I'm like, what's going on with it's like, what are they doing in this movie? And like, how did it's like, I think what he said was like they wanted to, I can't remember what it was, but his idea was like, well, why don't we put the video in the movie? And it's interesting how the movie all of a sudden transforms into a music video in a way. And it's like, oh, that's an interesting idea. I never thought of, but when you see that out of context, you're like, what the hell's going on? What is this?
Yeah, I know when you were on our previous episode, you talked about Body Double and the drill scene being a little bit too much for you, but I still think that in terms of, I think, movies that are pure De Palma, I think Body Double's definitely on that list, coupled with, Dress to Kill, Blowout, and even Phantom of the Paradise. And it's funny that I think, you talked about sort of the cult status of Phantom of the Paradise, but I think it's probably like, if people are aware of that movie, I think they're not aware of the fact that it's a De Palma film. I think once we get away from his early comedies, which, aren't really that well known at all, except for the De Niro connection. But I think in terms of like movies that have an audience, I think the people that are watching Phantom of the Paradise aren't watching it because it's a De Palma film. And I think it's probably De Palma's most unsung film.
Well, it is getting its due now. It might have been his unsung film for a while, but I think it is starting to get its due. And again, one of the reasons why people are finally catching up to it is, again, it was ahead. A lot of his films were ahead of its time. I mean, as we all know, I mean, Scarface didn't do well when it first came out. Now it's huge, classic. And then, the 20th anniversary of Carrie came along, and they did a big story about that in premiere. And it was, I think, right after Columbine had just happened. So then it was kind of like, that was kind of one of the angles of the story, was about how it kind of echoed that or kind of predated that in a way or something like that to some degree. I didn't make the connection myself, but again, that was a movie that did well when it came out. But I think as long as there's going to be disenfranchised teenagers, that's a movie that people are going to see and go, wow, like, look at how much hasn't really changed,
No, absolutely. And I think the thing is, but I think maybe my main idea was how many people are watching and loving Phantom of the Paradise and then saying, "Oh, I have to go watch X movie from De Palma now." I'm just wondering if it's one of those films that generates De Palma fans or it just generates cult movie fans.
I think it's starting to, for cult movie fans and also music people too, because again, the singer from The Darkness, Justin Hawkins, he did a whole thing on his channel about how he had just discovered the film and how much he loved it, and he was doing little pieces of the songs. And I knew a kid in my neighborhood who just was playing guitar and wanted to be in a band, and he had seen it on cable probably by accident and loved it. And like to him, Paul Williams was like a whole new guy. And it's
Yeah.
like, well, that guy's been writing music since before we were born. I mean, he's not like a new guy. He's been around for. It's kind of like that was the joke Cheap Trick used to make. Like in between songs, Rick Nielsen would say, "Hi, we're Cheap Trick. We're a new band."
Yeah. So we focused a little bit on the sequence from the movie, but do you overall want to just give any feelings about Phantom of the Paradise that you haven't been able to share yet?
Well, one thing I thought was interesting was years ago, I talked to Jay Cox, who knew Brian DePalma very well, and I believe they're still in touch. Jay was the film critic for Time magazine, and him and Martin Scorsese go way back. So he even knew George Lucas, before Star Wars and all that, because he was married to Verna Bloom, who knew Marcia Lucas from Medium Cool
Okay.
and all that stuff. So when I interviewed him a long time ago, we weren't just talking about Gangs of New York, which was coming up, but about some filmmakers he knew and things like that. And he had mentioned about how Phantom of the Paradise is actually somewhat of an autobiographical film for Brian De Palma, because it was about him trying to work within the system and getting crushed by it, because he had a really bad experience doing Get to Know Your Rabbit at
Hmm.
Warner Brothers. Then that's an interesting thing. Long time ago, I talked to Fred Weintraub, who was a producer at Warner Brothers. He produced Enter the Dragon, but he had mentioned to me, all those guys at Warner Brothers, I got them their deals, including the THX deal
George
with
Lucas.
Coppola and Lucas that went down the toilet. Brian De Palma had a deal there. Martin Scorsese had a deal there, and none of them really broke out of Warner Brothers with their deals. I mean, maybe Scorsese was the most successful, that he had Mean Streets and Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. But De Palma was part of that group, and it didn't go well. And so, from what I understood, it's like Phantom of the Paradise was a bit like him dramatizing this artist who gets crushed by a big machine, and then he becomes like like this guy. I'm not sure exactly how to describe it or whatever. I don't know if he was trying to be like a monster behind the scenes or anything like that. But he always had his mischievous side or whatever. But again, it was somebody who was kind of crushed by the system and was trying to get back at it in a way, which was an angle I had never considered before.
Yeah. I really, really, really love this movie. Again, in terms of De Palma movies, I think it's one of his most vibrant. It's a great movie to watch, and it's a great movie to listen to. And I really hope people listening to this that are De Palma fans, that focus on particular periods of De Palma's career, if you've overlooked this film, please check it out, because I think it's an important part of his filmography, and I think it helps really define him as an artist.
Yeah, and also if you just love great music and miss great music,
Yeah.
like in the 70s when so much good music was coming out and rock and roll was really exploding and becoming, there were so many great bands in those days. And, it came out early, when there was so much stuff like, the Rolling Stones were huge, and Led Zeppelin were playing stadiums, and so many great bands, and so many bands that, had their own style and did their own thing. And, there were a lot of rock bands, even heavy metal bands that, you know, they may have been that genre, but they all didn't sound exactly alike. Everybody had their own thing. Blue Oyster Cult didn't sound like Zeppelin. Zeppelin doesn't sound like Black Sabbath, that kind of thing. So, I mean, it kind of harkens back to an interesting era when, a lot of things were changing in rock and roll and in the business, and maybe not necessarily for the better, but, at the time it seemed like, and that's a funny thing too, because, I also think about that time when there were a lot of big stadium tours that were going around, like Alice Cooper did a big stadium tour. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young did a big stadium tour, because one thing that was mentioned in Almost Famous that is absolutely true was a lot of people thought rock and roll was going to be done
Yeah.
around that point. So, Alice Cooper, his plan was, let's do a huge tour, let's make as much money as we can and get out and retire. And
Yeah.
same thing with Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. But that's absolutely true that a lot of people thought this was all on the verge of collapsing, like it eventually did. But it took a while, but it did. And everyone's like, let's make as much money as we can and get the hell out of Dodge. So it kind of encapsulates that a little bit on a PG level, of course. But I think it kind of encapsulates that a little bit as well too when you think about it.
No, absolutely. Again, it's a movie I just adore, and it's one of my favorite De Palma movies. So we're talking about music, and you've actually written movie and music books. Do you want to talk a little bit about your books? And then I think there's also a recent project you've been involved with, if you'd like to talk about that.
Well, a recent project I've been trying to get off the ground, but it's really good. I mean, what's going on with the music business in Hollywood's going on with the book industry too, and it's like that's a whole other rigmarole in and of itself. But
Yeah, there was an article you sent over to me.
I'm trying to remember. I don't
The Eddie Van
recall.
Halen, the amplifier.
That's an older thing
Oh,
that happened to resurface at the same time. That's an article I wrote a long time ago
ah,
about people who used to modify amps for rock stars because it was hard to get good sounding Marshalls that sounded full blown in those days. And there were people that would like hot rod Marshalls, like you would hot rod a car. And Eddie Van Halen had a guy, and a lot of the amp companies, the boutique amp companies, grew out of that.
yeah, yeah. Well, I know you had sent me a link to that, so I'll make sure to forward that along. And then, do you want to talk about? You did a heavy metal book and then also a horror movie book.
Yes, yes. I think we talked about Real Terror before. That's my horror film book, which came out through St. Martin's Press. I believe the date was 2012. And a book I wrote called Bang Your Head. That was not the title I picked, but that's the title I got. That came out in 2002, and I was trying to do like an Easy Riders, Raging Bulls about heavy metal bands. And I tried to cover like from the 70s going into the 90s. And it begins with Black Sabbath, who, in my opinion, are the first proper heavy metal band. There's some
Right.
debate about
Yeah.
that, but it covers a lot of the stuff, not in the craziest details and everything. And that was one thing that I had kind of missed a little bit was how, again, 1973 was such a pivotal year, but I think 77 was a big pivotal year. That I do cover in the book about Kiss as a band. That's throughout the book. And, you had this crazy visionary like Neil Bogart who pushed them to the top. And, the record label, had all, it was so crazy back then, and people were doing drugs in the office and music was blasting out of PA speakers. And this was like when disco was the biggest thing since sliced bread. And then the whole business almost collapsed at the end of the decade. But Kiss were a part of that. I mean, wasn't just the music and the musicians. I mean, everything was so over the top like that, with the hype as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a real P.T. Barnum kind of thing with that, and I think with Phantom of the Paradise, that's something that De Palma definitely noticed and latched onto even before it got even crazier. But it also, Phantom of the Paradise isn't mentioned in the heavy metal book, but there is a fairly good chunk in the book about Spinal Tap and how that really nailed a lot of things on the head. I still am of the opinion to this day that I think it's the most accurate movie that's ever been made about heavy metal and the most accurate movie that's ever been made about rock and roll.
Yeah.
If anything, it's too close because if you talk to a lot of musicians and a lot of bands, especially a lot of like big metal and hard rock bands, they'll tell you the first time they saw that movie, they didn't laugh.
Yeah, because it felt like they were looking in a mirror.
It was too close.
Yeah.
It really hit the nail on the head. In fact, like you mentioned Eddie Van Halen. I remember he said in an interview when he saw it, and he loved the movie, but the first time he saw it, he was in the theater and he was looking around going, "What's so funny about that? We couldn't find the stage either." It's like I had like radio signals coming in my wireless. What's so funny about that? I went through that.
Yeah.
He wasn't. And there were some bands that really did not take Spinal Tap well at all. I mean, Steven Tyler tells the story about how the Aerosmith album at the time was Rockin' a Hard Place, and the cover was Stonehenge. So he's in the theater and Aerosmith's done, and he's probably down to his last $20. Everything's falling apart on him. Here's this band with the Stonehenge set, and he said he sunk so low in his seat he couldn't believe it. He was just like he said, I took that movie real personal. And it's funny too, because one thing I had also forgotten, he was a big prima donna about the deli tray, and that's in the Spinal Tap movie too.
Oh, with the bread that you have to keep folding. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like Turkey had to be off a roll for Steven Tyler, or he was threatened there was no gig, and whatever, and so I'm sure that was like, again, a lot of bands, and a lot of them love it, but it took a while, and Jeff Beck was a big fan, and Nigel Tufnell's based on him.
Yeah.
So he enjoyed it. So
yeah, so I'll definitely include a link to those two books,
awesome,
and also that the resurfaced article, and I'll also include any other things in the show notes that you might want me to share with the audience. But David, I'm so glad we were able to sit down once again and talk DePalma and talk Phantom of the Paradise, and I look forward to bringing you on the show many more times.
Oh, cool. I'd love to be on many more times.
All right, excellent.
Again, like for everyone who loves horror and metal, a lot of us like horror and metal. And so for anyone who hasn't read Bang Your Head or Real Terror, and if you want to read them both together, I think you'll dig it and find it a really interesting journey into horror and, and the glory days of metal and good, bad, or indifferent, how it impacted so many of us, because how many metalheads are also huge? Like you look at Kirk Hammett and his huge horror collection and all that stuff, and that's something that brings us all together, I think. Or like the death metal band Mortician. I remember the lead singer said he had 600 horror films in his collection. He said, "This is great. I'll never run out of ideas to write about."
Right on. And like I said, I'll include links to those books. And David, we'll talk again soon.
Sounds good, man. Thank you very much.